Good evening. Thanks for being here. If you don't know me, I'm Kristen Crow. I am co-leader of Indivisible North Metro Atlanta, and we are here today joined by Lisa, who is co-leader of Indivisible Twin Cities. And before we get started in conversation, we'll give you guys a couple of quick announcements. Our Indivisible group just released our voting for the 2026 primaries. That went out via email and is also in Slack. So if you haven't seen that, go check your email. It went out this morning. I forget when I sent it, this morning. So if you haven't heard the forum, if you haven't read our questionnaire, those documents are in the email, so I highly recommend you take a look at what the candidates have to say, how they answered our questions. You can watch the YouTube recording of the candidate forum at 2x and still get what you need. That's what I did. So you can still get the answers for what you need so that you can make your selections on the endorsements. You do not have to endorse every single race, so if you are only comfortable with endorsing governor or the statewide races, or you don't live in that House district and you would rather not make your voice known for that one, that's absolutely fine. You can still submit the form without voting for every race. We will close voting for that on Sunday at 6 p.m. Okay, Joe's nodding, 6 p.m. So go ahead and do what you can to look at all that stuff, take those votes. It will be by supermajority, so 60% of the voters will win, basically, as long as we have a nice threshold. Like if only 10 people vote, then we're not gonna endorse, because that's not great. And Sunday is our monthly member meeting on Zoom. It's a virtual meeting this month, and we will be talking all things election. So we're going to look at the ballot, we're going to talk about how you find out where to vote, how to vote, when to vote, if you're worried about voting, what you should do, as well as how you can get your neighbors and your friends and your family and your coworkers and your daughters and your grandkids and your sons and your uncles and everyone else to vote. So highly recommend coming to that as well if you are available Sunday at 2 p.m. And we do have some QR codes up here, one for the candidate survey. So if you're like, I'm never gonna find that email, you can scan the QR code and go ahead and fill out that form to make your endorsements. Also, if you're not on Slack, you can join that there. And I think the other one's a donation.
Yeah, it's a link to the website.
Link to the website where you can also then donate to our group. So thank you everyone for being here, and we will go ahead and get started. We're just gonna kind of do a little interview conversation situation here with Lisa, and then we'll open it up for folks who want to ask her questions about what she's been through. So Lisa, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to folks, tell them who you are and what you do.
Hi everybody, my name is Lisa Erbs, and I am a former resident of Alpharetta, Georgia. I grew up here in the Atlanta area. I attended Clarkston High School, and 10 years ago, about a month ago, I moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, and got involved with Indivisible very soon after that, right after Trump was elected the first time, and I realized that being a regular voter and staying on top of the news was just not enough, and more had to be done. So I've been with Indivisible now, 9 years, almost 10 years. So right after he announced that he was going to run the second time, we took a couple of smaller Indivisible groups in the Atlanta area, and we, am I talking funny?
No, I think it's this thing.
Okay. I thought I heard something weird. Anyway, we took three groups and we combined them, and we created Indivisible Twin Cities so that we would have a little bit bigger reach in a larger geographical area. And from that moment on, our lives changed forever. We can talk a little bit about how that happened. So.
And let's talk about that happen. So my question is, what was the first warning you had that Operation Metro Surge was on the way, or that something might happen in your immediate area? And what was your Indivisible group's reaction? How did you kind of think about what you'd heard? Did you do anything at that point? How did you move forward as soon as you had an inkling?
We started preparing for it last summer. We knew he was going to probably come to Minnesota. He doesn't like Minnesota. He hates our governor. He hates Ilhan Omar. He made it clear many times that he just doesn't like our state. So it's because we have a great quality of life and people are happy there. So anyway, so we started last summer working with several different immigrant rights groups to figure out how to get as many people trained as possible on constitutional observers. And I'm really proud to say that starting that last summer and up through the surge, 80,000 Minnesotans went through that training. And not all of them were active observers, but a lot of people said they went to the training because they wanted to know what to do if they encountered ICE or they encountered ICE as they were trying to detain somebody. And they just wanted to have all the information that they would need for that. And so, yeah, we had a lot of people get involved, and they got involved early. The training was so popular that different groups, the original groups that were doing the training were the immigrant rights groups, but because there was such a huge demand, a lot of different groups, including ours, started providing the training also so that more and more people could get involved in it. So that's how we started. When the actual surge began was late November, when Trump discovered that we had had a fraud issue in the state of Minnesota, but that had happened during COVID, and it was dealt with in like 2022. 76 people were indicted, and almost all of them had already been tried and convicted and put in prison. But it was this miraculous thing, like he does, where he was like, hey, there's fraud in Minnesota. We've got to go and start arresting and detaining Somali immigrants. And so that's when everything basically hit the fan.
So moving on, so you got everyone trained, a lot of people trained, and how did you mobilize them? So a lot of people obviously weren't ready to do much except say, I'm prepared if something happens in a space that I'm in. But you needed more than that. You needed people to go out, to chase, to witness, to record. Let's talk about the Whipple building too, and we can get there next. But before we get to the Whipple building, now you had all these people trained. How did you mobilize them? And what was the structure by which you alerted people to what was happening? How did you provide coverage, where you needed it, when you needed it, and how did all of that come to pass?
It went through a couple of iterations because ICE kept changing their tactics. So we had to change our tactics to kind of meet whatever they were doing. And one thing I do want to make perfectly clear, this was not all about Indivisible Twin Cities. This was about the entire Twin Cities community coming together to make this happen. So there were lots of groups, lots of organizations, lots of people who just saw something happening to their neighbor and decided they had to do something. So when I use the word we, I mean all of us, not just our group. We were heavily involved, obviously, and part of a lot of the planning and the organizing, but I always want to make sure that people understand that this is not just an Indivisible Twin Cities type thing. So as far as getting people mobilized, once you went through the training, you were given a whistle, a lanyard with a card on it that also had kind of know your rights information, and access to signal groups that had been set up for different roles and responsibilities. So people had different jobs. The main job was, for most people, was being an observer. So knowing, you get a signal chat that says ICE is on this street, get as many people there as you possibly can, and people would quickly get their cameras ready, whistles blowing, and take care of that. That's how it all initially started. Now, the Twin Cities is very different from Atlanta. It's about half the size, and it's pretty easy to get around. And even going back and forth between St. Paul and Minneapolis isn't really that difficult. And so early on, people were going like wherever. There were a couple of big raids that they did in the first week that were in St. Paul. One was at an industrial building. And at the time, what they would do is they would show up, there'd be like 20 or 30 agents, and they'd have like 10 vehicles. They'd all come in mass with their masks on and their guns and all their stuff. And then they would raid a building and try to take in as many people as they could get. And during that part, the observers were coming from all over the area, like anywhere and anyway. So somebody might say, I'm in South Minneapolis, I'll be there in 20 minutes, or what have you. So lots of observers would show up, and so it would get really chaotic and really weird and ugly really quickly. And in at least 2 of those instances, there was tear gas, there were rubber bullets, there were injuries to protesters, and it all got out of hand rather quickly. So what ICE figured out was this is a real efficient use of our time. And so they changed their tactics, and they decided that instead of going out in these big groups and trying to get a whole bunch of people at one time, they would do more targeted raids. And they would go out maybe 2 vehicles, maybe 4 agents, and they would hit up, they had names and addresses and people that they were specifically looking for, but they also just targeted people. And if you had brown skin and you were standing at a bus stop and they saw you, they would stop and grab you and throw you in the back of their car. And that is not an exaggeration that was happening. If you were just walking down the street, they would grab you, throw you in the back of the car, and take you to the Whipple building. So our tactics had to change too, and that's when it became more about these different roles and responsibilities. So for example, and I know I'm talking a lot, but there's a lot here.
This is the
So I'll kind of go through some of these. The first role that really was obvious is that there were people who took on the responsibility of staging themselves at the Whipple building, which is the federal building in Minneapolis. It's literally across the river from where we live, where ICE works out of. And so that's where all the immigration court stuff happens and all of that. So Whipple was the headquarters for all of this activity. So crews of people would stand outside the Whipple building. They would record every vehicle as it was coming and going, make, model, color, how many agents were in it, what the license plate number was, and there was a database. And so they would literally be on the phone, signal calls, relaying all of this information to someone who was inputting it into the database. So that was the first job. Then a dispatcher would say, okay, we have an ICE vehicle, this is the make, model, blah, 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 and it's heading to this neighborhood. And patrollers would be out in their cars, and they would be stationed in different parts of the city, and they would go find that car, and then they'd start following them. And the goal was to kind of distract them and maybe get them to not go to the place that they're targeting. And it worked sometimes, and other times it didn't. So they would follow them to a location, and at that point, the dispatcher would send out the signal message to the observers. The observers would come out of their houses because they were literally organized block by block and neighborhood by neighborhood. So they knew if they were on this street, at this intersection in South Minneapolis, go to this signal group, tell them that they're there, and that people would come out, start blowing their whistles, and start documenting. So all of that was happening, and that all came about really fast. I mean, it was literally like days, and all of this process worked.
You guys all thought everyone just showed up, right, and started blowing their whistles, yeah. So, Lisa, you made it sound like it just happened, these pods. Can you talk a little bit more about how the neighborhoods organized together and how the community members basically, regardless of if they were Indivisible or an immigrants' rights group or just a person off the street, how those groups of people came together to create their own little pod to then be mobilized when the ICE agents showed up in their area?
Part of it is cultural. I'm not a native Minnesotan, but I live with one. And I can tell you most people in the Twin Cities especially, but across Minnesota, are very community-minded people. And they take it seriously. And so getting them to organize themselves within their neighborhoods was almost just this organic thing. You'd have one or two people that would go door to door and say, hey, let's form our own signal group so that we can all know when it's time to go out and blow our whistles and take pictures of ice. And so it was completely organic. It was some of the people, like, we did have our own team members, right, who organized their own neighborhoods. They were organized around schools, they were organized around churches, and some, in some businesses, especially immigrant-owned businesses. And so while it sounds kind of like this can't possibly have been like that, it really was like that. People just figured it out. They saw what needed to be done and they just started doing it. And everybody was talking to each other and connecting people. I mean, I already knew a lot of people in the Twin Cities, but I can't tell you how many people I met during that 2.5 month period. So it was just one of those things where people really did just figure out, we need to organize our street or our block or the area around this park, whatever it was. And ICE was targeting certain areas more than others. For example, where we live in St. Paul, they were there, we saw them quite a bit, but they weren't it wasn't like a huge presence all the time. But there were certain neighborhoods over in Minneapolis, especially like in the area where Renee Good was killed and where Alex Preddy were killed, they were over there all the time. You could count on it. So it was a little easy for people to know where to be and know where they needed to station themselves.
I think that's a great lesson at mobilizing at scale, right? Is relying on people and their cultural tendencies already and their desire to build community and protect each other that didn't leave Indivisible and the immigrants' rights groups and other advocacy groups and other interested parties to try and put the word out, go here and go there and be everywhere, which I think is unique.
And one other thing too, they were also connecting with each other when they would go through their training. Mm-hmm. So while they would be in the training, they would start talking about where do you live, and they were making those connections so that they would know who they could reach out to.
Mm-hmm. So were those trainings all in person?
No,
they were virtual.
No. Some of them were Zoom. They started out in person, but then it became so big we had to start doing Zoom.
So tell us a little bit about what you think the most successful actions were, and obviously ICE didn't leave completely, but they did scale back a bit and it became less obvious. What do you think were some of the tactics or actions or kind of infrastructure that you put together that you feel like was very successful and worked really well?
That's an interesting question. I haven't been asked that before. And I've been asked a lot of questions. But I would say, again, it probably goes back to the grassroots level of the organizing. But also, we knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that their whole goal was to enrage us enough to become violent. And we had all lived through George Floyd, and we knew that would be devastating if we allowed it to happen, because Trump was just looking for an excuse to call on the military or start the Insurrection Act or bring in more people. I mean, we had at one point 3,300 ICE agents on the ground in the Twin Cities. Between St. Paul and Minneapolis police departments, we only have 1,200 officers. So they outnumbered our police by these huge, huge numbers, and it really caused a lot of problems for the local police. But I think really the most successful thing is that we all were so determined not to let things get violent. We were all, aside from the observer trainings, we were also holding de-escalation training. We were holding civil disobedience training so that people understood how far down the line they could go before they would get in trouble or get arrested. And it worked. And I think even those people, there were some, we always have some people that get a little rowdy. But for the most part, we were able to keep everybody on the same page that there would be no violence and we wouldn't play into that. And so I think that was probably the most successful thing.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship that you or any of the groups had with the local police, if any, or any interactions that you had with them that might have helped or harmed? You know, I think No Kings in particular gets a lot of flack because most events work well with the police, and it's often because most events are majority white. So can you talk a little bit about how that worked or didn't work or just was non-existent from your perspective?
Early on, it was not good. Especially, we had, like I was mentioning, the first two big raids were in St. Paul, and the St. Paul police did not respond well. They kind of messed it up. So but the good news was that they knew they had messed it up, and they reworked things, they regrouped, and then they didn't do that again. So that was good.
Learn one time to learn a lesson.
Right, and the Minneapolis Police Department actually did a really good job. The police chief there was on the news all the time, Chief O'Hara. He really kept things under control. Again, nobody wanted a repeat of George Floyd, so the police were very much aware that everybody in the country and mostly around the world were watching, and so they were being very, very careful. Hennepin County, which is the county where Minneapolis is, we had some issues with them. And their police chief is actually, she's a pretty sharp lady, and she gets it, and she also didn't want to have bad press with her group, and so she actually reached out to us Indivisible Twin Cities, and wanted to have regular meetings with us to talk about what was going on, and hearing, because we wrote something nasty about her and she didn't like it. So she was like, I want to meet with you. And we're like, okay. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go to that meeting. I wish I had. But she, so they were really trying to do their best. But not every situation can be controlled. I mean, it's that simple.
So we talked about success. Tell us about some of the big and small challenges you had while you were trying to stop an invasion, do a day job, take care of your kids, buy your groceries, and also watch the rest of the country kind of fall apart around other things happening. But it's a lot, right? So the challenge was obviously everything, of course, but can you tell us a little bit about specific challenges that you felt like really cropped up as you were trying to mobilize at scale and protect a population of people that were being targeted?
I think it was the fact that one of the hard things that I personally had to go through was worrying about I tend to internalize a lot of things and worry about everybody, everybody in this room, I'm gonna worry about you. So that became quite stressful, and to the point of kind of not being manageable. But I would say nothing really comes to mind too much. A lot of times it was feeling like we couldn't respond fast enough to certain things as they were happening. And for example, we had, if something, especially early on when we had those two events in St. Paul, we were kind of left flat-footed and kind of like, how do we respond to this? What are we going to do? And so we had to get good at getting in front of stories, reaching out to the media more, making sure our side of the story was being told versus what DHS and ICE and Trump were saying to the world. And so that was part of it. Then the other thing that was frustrating, and we had a lot of people, especially in the organizing world, who were really just, they were very impatient with our local officials. So they were absolutely certain that Tim Walz, Jacob Fry, Mayor Hurd, the police departments, they were just certain that they weren't doing anything. And we were like, they're doing stuff. They're working their butts off. What are you talking about? And so that became sort of a internal tension that was going on amongst different groups because they were just so stubbornly convinced that there was nothing happening when there was literally daily action calls between all of the people that I just mentioned and people in the federal government. And they were trying to negotiate, trying to make things less bad. That went on the entire time, from the day it started till the day it ended. And people didn't have that visibility, and so they just assumed nothing was happening. So I'd say that was probably the most frustrating thing, because we kept trying to tell people that, it's like, no, there's good things happening, it's fine. And they just refused to believe it. To this day, they don't believe it. We have a whole bunch of people who just don't like Tim Walz, and Tim Walz is an amazing governor and does a fantastic job, and we've just had to just keep trying to come to his defense over and over and over again. So
I was going to talk about moving to Georgia, but I want to touch on that a little bit. So how did you successfully work in coalition with all these different groups of people who have one same goal, but might have different tactics, have different other opinions about other issues, Tim Walz, your government, as well as a whole bunch of other things, and everyone's coming together for this one thing, but not everybody is a monolith, right? So can you talk a little bit about how, as an indivisible group, you worked in coalition with other advocacy groups and indivisible groups and just kind of other groups on the ground in this work?
Well, we were really lucky, because a year ago this month, we joined in coalition with 3 other groups in the area to put on Hands Off. And so we have, it's Indivisible Twin Cities, it's Women's March Minnesota, which is not affiliated in any way with the National Women's March, the Minnesota AFL-CIO, and Minnesota 5051. And our groups formed what we then started calling the No Kings Coalition, just for these big mass mobilizations. So we did Hands Off, we did No Kings the first one, we did one in the middle around Good Trouble, all of the things that you all have been doing here as well. And so we already had those relationships already in place. And part of what happened was obviously each one of those groups has their own, other groups that they work with. And so it just sort of became this big homogenous thing. And, but yeah, there were issues around, some tactics and things that people tried to do, especially at the Whipple building. I guess I would classify the regular protesters at Whipple as intense. Very intense.
Okay. That makes sense. So you are a Georgia native, an Alpharetta, Metro Atlanta native. So give us some advice on what we can start doing now, right? Like we all think they're coming to Atlanta, right? Like eventually, it's not going to be great. And I think you and I talked about this as well, that maybe it's not ICE immediately, maybe it's election protection and election interference that we have to work toward and work around. And we talked a lot about how some of the tactics that you used for your mobilization and your neighborhood communities and getting people trained could potentially work for something like that, and that you are doing that in Minnesota as well. So can you talk a little bit about both of those things, the movement toward election protection with the folks that have been trained, as well as what you think, based on your knowledge of both Minneapolis and the metro area, what we could be doing now to get prepared for either ICE or bad things?
So I have a question first, though.
Yes.
Is there groups here doing any kind of constitutional observer training at this point?
Yes, so we have an immigrants' rights group that does it, that does specifically for like ICE observing and that kind of training. ACLU has just opened a new like monitoring, observing for the election training. I think that they might have had one already. So that is happening, and ACLU has done a bunch of Know Your Rights trainings as well. And then we do typically de-escalation training with the American Friends Service Committee. Right now it's been mostly for protesting, right? So
you've already made great progress, because those are all things that you should be doing, and getting as many people involved as you possibly can in all of those things, because that really was kind of what got us through the first few weeks of it, because we already had all of that kind of lined up, and people we're ready to go. I think I have an opinion here about
Let's hear it.
what ICE may do next. I think they kind of aren't going to look at they're not going to keep doing it the same way.
Right.
Because they failed so miserably in Minnesota. It was, and anybody with eyeballs could see that, right? It wasn't, anybody could see that they were failing at what they were trying to do. So why would you repeat that? Of course, they're not the brightest people in the world, so there's that. But I suspect, so I want to say this, what they're doing in Minnesota now, they're still there. They're still disappearing people. They're still flying people out on ICE flights to Louisiana and Texas. They just shipped 67 people a couple of days ago. So they're still doing things. They're still picking people up. They're just doing it completely under the radar. I mean, just very quietly, more targeted. They're going into more rural areas and more suburban areas. They're not doing as much in the cities where it's real obvious and so many people can see them. So I say all that to say, I'm not so sure they'll do another like Operation Midway Blitz or Operation Metro Surge. I think they're going to just sort of casually roll into town and start grabbing people. I could be wrong. Who knows? Because as we get closer to the election, I think Trump will do more and more desperate things and more things to get attention. Right now we have a war that everybody's paying attention to, but there's no telling what he'll do. We all know that. We've seen him do it for all these years. So I guess I would say the best things to do now is to focus on the documenting and the organizing of being ready for when something occurs, but I think, especially because you're in Fulton County, Georgia, you all are going to have a hell of a time with these elections. Yeah. And if I were planning down here, if I was organizing down here, that would be my 100% focus, is what are they going to do, especially right here in this exact spot, because he's already taken the ballots. They're already trying to figure out ways to manipulate that, and that's all just a lead up to what they're going to try to do as we get closer to the midterms. So one of the things we're already working on, we've started in the last couple of weeks, is I mentioned those 80,000 people across the state of Minnesota who have been trained. We're reaching out to every single one of them, and we're going to try to get them trained in election protection methods, whatever that involves. And we've divided the election into 3 pieces. It is everything starting from right now until when early voting starts. That is trying to take care of anything that is related to voter suppression or trying to take away files or get voter rolls. All the things, trying to pass the SAVE Act, whether that's at the state level or the federal level. We just had a vote this morning in our Minnesota House where the Republicans in Minnesota were trying to pass a SAVE-like bill that had all the same stuff in it that the federal bill has. It did not pass, but it was close because our House is almost completely evenly divided. So there's pre-election stuff, getting out the vote, some of those usual things, but just doing it at a bigger scale. Then when early voting starts until election day, it is poll protection. It's standing outside of polling locations, monitoring things, making sure there's not people there harassing voters or trying to keep them from going in. That type of thing. Having as many people in your group as possible volunteering to work in the polling locations, not necessarily outside, but inside as well. And then there's what happens when the election's over. Making sure every vote is counted, making sure they all get certified, making sure that the people who actually won the election get sworn in and get to go work at every level. And so that's where we're focusing now. Every single thing we're doing is that. And like I said, you guys, we were the center of the universe for the immigration raid. I really think so. I think you're in the center of the universe of what's going to happen with voting.
Sweet.
I don't mean to be,
You're gonna hang out here in November, right? Come for a few weeks.
Yeah.
And,
I love falling.
Great,
Sure.
great. Any closing thoughts before we let folks who might have any questions for you?
No, we covered a lot of things. I would just say that one piece that we did not talk about that was just as important as everything else was the mutual aid that kicked in. And again, very organically, people saw needs, they started taking care of it. Food, getting food and delivering food to people who were now locked inside their houses and too afraid to leave. Monitoring all the schools to make sure that, because ICE would park out in front of schools to intimidate people and intimidate the students and their parents. Walking kids to school or to the bus stop or what have you. Patrolling at all the mosques and mostly Hispanic churches to make sure people could still go to services. We had a group that formed at the Whipple building completely organically, but it has now grown, where they happened to be out there protesting one day and they saw this person walking out of the Whipple building. It was January, it was way below freezing. They didn't have a coat, they didn't have a hat, they didn't have gloves, they didn't have a phone, they didn't have any ID. They had been detained and then let go with nothing, absolutely nothing. Turns out that's what they were doing to everybody. So literally taking people in like 20 below weather in Minnesota and putting them out into the elements with nothing. No way to get home, no way to call somebody, a family member, nothing. So a woman named Natalie saw that and she immediately jumped into action. And before you know it, they had food, they had donated warm clothing, they had burner phones, they had a warming tent. So as soon as they came out, they could take them to the warming tent and they would get them home, they would get them to a safe place, they would get them what they needed. And now what we're dealing with in Minnesota is rent assistance, because so many people lost work during the surge that now they are in danger of becoming evicted. And so there's a ton of work going on around that. So I just want to give that shout out too, that it's not just that interaction with ICE all the time, but all these mutual aid pieces that came along with it that made all the difference in the world.
Awesome, thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Lisa? Yes.
We all know about Minnesota Nice. In the early part of what your presentation, you talked about going door to door. What do you do if somebody comes to the door and they're wearing a MAGA hat?
Well, I'll be honest with you. That doesn't happen too often in the Twin Cities. It's a pretty safe space. That's not to say they're not there. There's a few, but mostly that does not happen. But as you go out, Minnesota is like most states now. It's very divided, and especially out in the rural areas. But I've done my share of door knocking for candidates and stuff, especially out in the suburbs, and occasionally you're going to get that, but people are usually pretty nice. That's not really a cliche, it's kind of real. So most of the time it's not a problem, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. We have family members. Everybody does.
Any other questions? Yes.
Two just brief questions. One, this is my ignorance. Are there like immigrant detention centers in the Minneapolis area, and like how did you did you deal with that? And then the other one is, did you have to deal with any like xenophobic vigilantes who are like there to support ICE and to make immigrants' lives even more miserable? And so how you dealt with that?
Yes to both. Well, let me address the detention center piece. I keep referring to the Whipple building because that's the headquarters. They would hold people at Whipple for a while, and then they would either send, we have a couple of counties in Minnesota who have signed 287G agreements with ICE, so they would take people into their jails for ICE if they needed them to. So that is a problem. They're a little bit further out in greater Minnesota. We did have a situation, two situations actually, where ICE was trying to buy warehouse space in two suburbs, Woodbury and Shakopee. And I am very proud that our indivisible groups in both of those places, metro area indivisible groups, all joined together and they stopped that in their tracks. I mean, it was amazing and it happened very quickly. The people in Woodbury, the city council didn't know what was going on. We're hearing a lot about this, where this is happening in other places. They don't tell the city council what to do. They don't ask permission. They just buy these places, and then they're like, oh, by the way, we're going to need, 1 million gallons of water a week. Figure it out. So we were able to stop two facilities from being used in our area. We do have a place in western Minnesota, really close to the South Dakota border, that was a private prison and had been closed for a while, and the company that owns that building is in the process of making it a detention facility. So we will have one in Minnesota. Hopefully it'll be the only one though. And then, the other question. Yeah, we had mostly like TikTok influencer people would come to town and try to get some media attention, like with Jake Lang. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of him, but he's an idiot. And he would, I'm going to come to Minnesota and we're going to have this big pro-ICE rally, and like 4 people would show up. And so he embarrassed himself there several times. And the last time, people were spraying him with silly string, and he was actually rescued by a black man and a trans woman. They wanted to help him. They didn't want him to, have more silly string on him, and they escorted him and got him to a car so that he could make his getaway, which, that just shows you how nice people are, right? So that was really the most of it. We would get a few counter-protesters at some of the rallies, but that's not that unusual. And you can usually quiet them down pretty quickly.
Other questions?
I have a question. How did you deal with the national press? I mean, I know Chris Hayes was there, and it looked like everybody who had a camera or microphone went. And how did you deal with that?
I have to look at my partner on this one because it was pretty crazy. Indivisible has a lot of name recognition, and Ezra and Leah are everywhere all the time, and so as Indivisible Twin Cities, the media was just coming to us for everything, just constantly. We have a communications team, and they were basically taking all the requests and making sure they were legitimate first of all, and then helping to kind of schedule interviews. But I would say at the height of the surge, me personally, I was being interviewed multiple times a day by media from all over the world, and it was kind of weird and surreal, but it was also helpful because it was we kind of felt like that had become part of our job at that point. Like I've been saying, everybody had a job, and at that point, Rebecca and I, we are the co-leaders of Indivisible together, and we do everything as a team, and we just said, this is our job right now. Our job is to talk to the media, and so there was a lot of that. We did have a couple of negative stories in right-wing media where they were trying to call us out specifically. That got a little hairy, but it was really bizarre.
Anybody else?
How long did it last in Minnesota? You said it started in November, It
They,
got kind of quiet while you were still.
right, so it officially started December 2nd, and it officially ended on February 12th. Alex Preddy's death was the beginning of the end. I think that one, well, everything was shocking, right? Everything that you saw was shocking. But when he was killed, I think that was sort of a turning point for the administration, where they were like, this really doesn't look good. We just shot a man 10 times in the back.
And nobody's believing our lies about it.
Yeah, and nobody's believing what we're telling them. And because you've got film from multiple different angles showing you what happened, right? And so that's when we started seeing things change a little bit. And then when Tom Homan showed up and they fired Bovino, who was just the most slimy person ever, he came in and he, for all his bad points, right? He's not a good guy, I'm not gonna say that. But he's at least a mature adult who knows about negotiating and knows about talking to people and trying to get things done. And so he opened up dialogue with Governor Walz and Keith Ellison and the mayors of the two cities, and they were able to walk through. But the thing was, he still got to say, oh, this has been a smashing success and everything's wonderful, but now we've taken care of all the problems here, so now we can draw down how many agents we have. So everybody knew they were lying, but so it was December 2nd to February 12th.
Thanks.
Question?
It's coming up soon. We might reasonably expect ICE to make an appearance for the FIFA event in Atlanta in June and July. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, is there any advice you could give for, local indivisible groups to prepare for that if they try to make a large public appearance?
I think you can assume, right, because it's a soccer event, that there would be a lot of immigrant people who would probably like to go to that and attend it. And because they have no shame in racial profiling at all, I think that if you think that might be something that would happen, is to try to figure out how to protect those areas. Again, it's not a neighborhood, it's not it's not a Mexican restaurant, it's this giant place, and maybe what you do is you form on the ground teams who are going to be stationed around the facility to just kind of help people out. I don't know, and maybe things like offering transportation to people to get back and forth, and because again, if they see people on like MARTA, they'll go after them. They did that with our Metro Transit, and they've got kicked off, but they were trying to go after people on our Metro Transit. So that's where I kind of my brain goes, is figuring out how to organize teams of people who are well trained to monitor it.
Thank you.
I think it'll be a lot like the abortion clinic escorts combined with rides to the polls situation, right? Which is something at the state level we've been talking about as part of election protection, is how do you get people who don't even want to get in their car to go to the poll because they're afraid someone will be standing there. So how do you transform rides to the polls not just to like poll Uber, but poll protection Uber, as well as have someone meet them there when they get out, or a group of people meet them there when they get out. I think it'll be same as that, but also I would encourage you to look at Fair Play at ATL, which is an organization that got started specifically to work in the city and some of the real crappy things the city is doing to the people who live here in order to make way for FIFA and what's happening. It's a great organization. It's run by a guy who was a big part of the labor movement for a while, and has a great board. And so I would highly recommend them if you're specifically interested in supporting actions around FIFA.
And one other thing that I just thought of, and I haven't lived here for 10 years, so you'll have to excuse me, my ignorance. Where is it going to be?
Mercedes-Benz.
Where?
Mercedes-Benz.
Oh, okay. So it'll be
Football
at
stadium.
where the Falcons play. Okay.
Yeah.
The city runs that, right? I think.
Yes.
Where I'm going with this is start putting pressure on whoever runs that stadium now and insist that they don't let ICE anywhere near it. That kind of pressure really works, and we've had a lot of success with that in different ways in the Twin Cities. Putting pressure on corporations and city government officials works, just as Target. And so I mean, that to me would be something that you could start doing now and start finding out and reaching out to whoever you can find that's in charge and say, you need to commit right now that you're not going to allow this to happen anywhere near your facility or in downtown Atlanta at all.
Which again is what Fair Play is working on. Not specifically for what you're talking about, but just in general, making those connections and putting pressure on those city officials and the corporations that will be involved to make sure that things are fair.
Yeah, anybody who's sponsoring it,
Right, yes.
all of them,
Yeah.
all of them are vulnerable.
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that ICE was kicked off city or county public transportation. Can you talk to us more about how you think that happened? Was it a pressure by your organization and other organizations or city officials, county officials?
It was more at the city level. So St. Paul and Minneapolis are both sanctuary cities. And so they are dedicated to not working with ICE, not providing them with any type of assistance. And so, for example, in St. Paul, they passed a resolution that basically said they were not allowed on any St. Paul-owned property at all, period. No parks, no recreation centers, no courthouses, the whole deal. The Metro Transit thing, Metro Transit is run by like a regional group, and I'm not sure how that occurred, but I think it was mostly, I think that basically the Metro Transit cops just, they only tried it once or twice that I'm aware of, and then that kind of didn't happen again, so.
Just one media call that Lisa got that you could all relate to, and it's pretty funny, came from Fox National, and they were working on a story about how much all the Indivisible people were getting paid. And they wouldn't believe that, no, we're not getting paid. We even have to pay our own gas.
Yes.
Still waiting for that reimbursement though.
Yeah. Paid protester thing.
Come on, man.
Yes, yeah, we're all unpaid protesters. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? All right. Okay. Well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you. Appreciate you guys. Appreciate Lisa being here. And just a reminder, election work that she talked about, all those things that she is doing in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities and St. Paul are things we're going to do here. So we're going to start those conversations on Sunday at our monthly member meeting. Early voting starts on Monday for the primary. So another final reminder for your endorsement vote. There's a QR code. Check your email. Thank you, everyone.
You want to share the voting for endorsements with anybody and everybody?
No, only Indivisible members should be voting. Good question. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Unsend. No, thank you.